Harnoncourt Leuders, where I come from right now, is Paris. I've been there for 42 years, but my original place of birth is Albuquerque, and I grew up in Indiana, southern Indiana.
Oh, wow. Okay. I knew you very fleetingly as an undergrad at Yale, and what were you studying at that time?
Well, I started in, I can't remember the name of the program. It was possible for some students to, in their freshman year, to have a kind of pre-major. So I started in intensive music with David Beach, studying theory and other classes, and I did eventually major in music.
You did. I wondered about that. All right. So you came to Paris on a government grant?
Yes, there was no Fulbright to France, and so when I applied for a Fulbright, they just sort of shunted it into the French government system, and I was accepted. And
subsequently you studied organ in Paris?
It was for that I went there, and I studied with Maurice Durufle for 2 years.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay, so that explains how you got connected to the harmonium. Or does it?
Well, it doesn't at all. I mean, these people in his generation would have thought of the harmonium at best as a sub-organ. I think it had more to do with chance, meeting someone who was very precociously interested in the harmonium, named Michel Diternin, who is known to all harmonium people because he did basically the first major thesis on the instrument in, I think, the early 70s, or maybe, in any case, early on, before anybody else had really done any study.
Wow.
He also had a collection that he put at people's disposal, so I was able to, and I was fairly close to him. He was also an amateur church organist. He worked for Nestle as far as his profession went, but he was an amateur church organist, and so we collaborated together on various projects.
Mm-hmm. So you started really getting involved with the harmonium in the 1980s, correct?
Or much 90s? Earlier than that. No, it was in the mid-70s, I think.
Oh,
it may have gotten rolling in the 80s because of possibilities for repertoire and concerts, but I remember that we did. When I say we, with him, we didn't organize. It was called the Festival Estival de Paris. It was in this summer. And we did the first harmonium concert, probably, that had been done for decades, in the church of Notre-Dame-des-Blancs-Manteaux for the French television, French radio. And it was done with a harmonium and with a pedal piano. It was actually a kind of put together pedal piano. It wasn't an original pedal piano, but Georges Guilmant played the piano. He played Boilly, and I think Boilly, in any case, original pieces for pedal piano. That was an very early
yes, very
phenomenon.
Right. Okay. Well, this explains why you are here. You're a long-time performer and scholar in this field, and you're all dressed in black today because you just came off the stage, having been the harmoniumist in the Rossini Petite Messe solennelle, on which you are considered quite an active scholar. And that was the reason I wanted to interview you, because you have a lot of experience with the manuscripts and, as a performer, practical experience. So I'm hoping you could give people an idea of where things started and where they have gone, and what your own method is with these materials as a harmonium player.
Yes, well, there's many things to be said because the piece has a complicated history. It's not a deeply complicated history, but it's maybe a little bit like the Bruckner symphonies or other certain repertoire pieces where you have one or two or three versions and you have to decide which one to use or to make a syncretic version or whatever. And the Mass is that way. To summarize, it was performed in a chamber music version, the first version, which was expressly dedicated to a count in Paris named Piléville, who was dedicating a private chapel and had a huge mansion in the northwest of Paris. Just huge. He could take maybe 40 or 50 people, plus the performers in performance. So that was where the Rossini Mass was given, with a piano, harmonium in the form of a harmonicord, which is a hybrid instrument with piano strings. And I just discovered, or recently discovered, that the second piano was probably an upright piano, and that's something that people didn't know up till now. So that makes for a kind of orchestration. But be that as it may, that version fell by the wayside because Rossini did an orchestration on his own initiative. Mainly, he said, to prevent others like Berlioz or Mr. Sachs, he said, saxophones and all, to come in and make a travesty out of it. And then he died, and after his death, that orchestra version was made into a kind of piano reduction, which was the basis for all of the editions like this one, the Ricordi edition that's presently available. These editions were not, this edition itself was not overseen by Rossini at all. In a sense, it has its historical value, and it is for piano, harmonium, and the usual vocal forces. So that's what we're working with. We're basically working with 3 versions. The orchestral one is very rarely done. And when you perform the piece, you have to decide how you're going to do it, with 1 piano, with 2 pianos. And the harmonium part has changed between the versions, because what you have in the harmonium part of the modern edition, the latest of the editions, is a kind of amalgam. It's a kind of mishmash of what was in the original and what the orchestral version was reduced to. Now, these are the editions that were made. One was made in the 80s, very obscure, and I first got to know that edition when I played the harmonium part in Épinal in eastern France. The people were, it was a very high-class choir, and they had that edition. It was an Italian edition, kind of confidential, and it didn't get around. And then in the early 90s, these 2 editions, one by Oxford and one by Carus, were done. And these went back to Rossini's manuscripts, which are in Pesaro, in the foundation, the Rossini Foundation. And then finally, a few years ago, this is the monumental Rossini edition, and Philippe Gosset, who is the specialist for Rossini in general, for the world over, with, I think Patricia Browner, her name is, did this edition of the Rossini Mass, and he was able to come up with a manuscript which had been given to this family of friends. It was a banker family, so they had a lot of money. And they have a manuscript in the family that is a kind of carbon copy, but in fact it's not all copy, it's not exactly the same. So this huge monumental edition, which can be used for performance, but it's very cumbersome and heavy, magnificent, totally new edition, I think it's Bärenreiter, in the Rossini series, the complete works, has everything, and a very extensive preface, as you can see, in English and in Italian. So actually the best thing, the safest thing, is to use this edition. But already if you don't have 2 pianos, you have to go back to this one. And I stopped there because it's very, very complicated, of course, if you want to go really into the nitty-gritty. There is no single edition that one can use. And be sure, number 1, that all the notes are accurate, and especially number 2, that they are in keeping with Rossini, what Rossini himself wanted. Right.
Now, on the practical side of all this, first of all, this piece is performed quite a lot, and not only in Europe, but in America quite a lot.
It is, very much. Yeah.
And oftentimes the harmonium part, almost invariably, is played on the pipe organ, at least in the United States, which...
Yeah, I must say that would never happen in France.
Oh, of course not.
Or in Europe, I don't think that would happen.
No longer that.
But it's partly because the harmonium is so relatively available, despite its somewhat a decrepitude it's gone through, but it's now a revival, so it's all the more easy. If I may just make a parenthesis, what happens as a kind of counterpart or a pendant to that is that the harmonium part is actually quite often played on an accordion, on a concert accordion.
Yes, I've seen that, yeah.
That's done quite a bit now, and there would be much to say about that too, I think.
Right. Well, I think what I would like to see is your commentary on the Ricordi, which is what most people, at least in the United States, are confronting, with the massive number of stop changes that seem to be totally impractical in some movements.
Yeah, that's easily explained. If you look at any of the original, those that are based on Rossini's manuals, manuscripts, excuse me, Rossini's manuscripts, none of them ever have any stop changes, stop indications at all. Here's one. And that's simply because Rossini wrote basically for a generic instrument. At the time he was conceiving the piece, I think he just was doing a mass with piano. And then it was realized that there was this harmonicorde, a kind of mixture instrument, in the Pilet-Will residence. And so he wrote a harmonium part. And then somebody came up to him, I guess, and said, hey, you know, we have in a back room, in a bedroom or something, I don't know, in a salon, we have an upright piano. So you could actually have a second piano part. Ah, that's cool. So we have this manuscript. I don't think there's any manuscript of Rossini's that has the three parts in it, but these were added. So what we can be getting at with the harmonium is that it was a kind of an addition in any case. It was as if someone wrote a symphony or another piece for string orchestra, and then realized, well, this would be pretty good if we had a few woodwinds. So let's add a woodwind part, but you could still play it with the string orchestra. And in general, I think, I've not done the experiment, but I believe that it would be possible to perform the entire Mass without exception on the piano with no other instruments.
Well, don't tell that to any harmoniumists that
Well, I
get
don't
gigs.
know why we should tell them. It's one of these uncomfortable truths. What comes about is the problem is with the Preludio Religioso.
Yes.
Now, in the Rossini Mass, as the Ricordi and other, there's Peters, there's Novello, there may be an Italian edition, and Calmus for that matter. The harmonium, as I said, incorporates probably woodwind passages from the orchestra version. So it's understandable that Rossini himself, he didn't just sit down and orchestrate his piece. He actually rewrote passages, or at least beefed them up, you might say, because he had an orchestra at his disposal. Right. So a very good example is the first measure, basically, in the Kyrie. You have these little deep, deep, deep.
Yes.
And that comes in one measure earlier in the orchestra, I believe. In any case, in the Ricordi than it does in the authentic editions, you might say. And there are countless others. Some of the harmonies are actually more subtle in the original than they are in Ricordi, and vice versa. So, you know, what you do. The harmonium part in the Preludio Religioso is absolutely and unquestionably not Rossini's idea. He wrote this for piano, period, and it was played virtuosely, whatever, virtuosic, by George Mathias at the original, the premiere performance. Right. And the harmonium idea comes from the Brandeus, this French edition from 1869, just 1 year after his death, where they sort of borrowed the idea from the orchestra, where it's played by an organ, that the fugal part from the Preludio Religioso could be played on the harmonium. It says piano or organ. Right. And so, again, it's not Rossini's idea, but it's very interesting because it sounds really a lot better on the harmonium, and you can do things on the harmonium that the pianist can't hardly do. Exactly. Which is these decrescendos, which the harmonium just does all by itself. Yeah. So I personally let the conductor decide, but I think that certain experiences I've had suggest that conductors either don't like the harmonium, don't understand it in any case, right, and to a great extent don't care. They're interested, they really know what they're used to, or they prefer what they're used to and what they know already. And I've always had extremely enthusiastic reactions from audiences and other musicians in the performance. Absolutely. About playing this on the harmonium. We never realized the harmonium could do this. And of course, we all know that who played the harmonium. But in this piece, it's a bit strange because you can't really play the introduction and the little postlude. But that's not really a big problem. And so, you know, what do you do? And I think that I may actually push a little bit more for the harmonium doing it. What's a problem is if it turns out that the pianist has worked on the piece and gotten it up, and you feel sort of
Like a
so
tack
good
on?
about trying to push the pianist away. On the other hand, it can definitely be argued that the piece was conceived for piano. In fact, it was a piano piece. I have a copy of the manuscript here. And he didn't conceive of this piece for the Mass. It was added, borrowed from his piano collections of his late age. And so you can see, well, you can't see, but it's right here. There is no indication of harmonium ever from Rossini himself.
Right.
So this is an example, a very good example of all of the things that you have to look through when you're doing the performance. Of course, you can go with one of the editions that you happen to have, or pick up. The one I like the most is Carus, which is very, very handy. The pages stay flat. It's easy to read. The staves are large enough. And you can count on this, you know. But then if you want to play the harmonium in the Preludio Religioso, you have to do it from some other score, such as Ricordi. I didn't answer the question then about the registrations. It's very simple. This was posthumous, of course, and obviously there were the crescendos and decrescendos. And so whoever did the actual reduction and prepared the manuscript for this edition, Brandus, French publisher, didn't know what harmonium was about. And so he apparently went and asked somebody who played the harmonium, hey, you know, what do I do? Do I need to pull on stops and everything? And any good harmonium player would have told him, no, basically you just pump more strongly or less strongly. But he found out that the stops are used in the order 1, 4, 3, 2, grand jeu.
Right.
So what you have, and you have to do them for the trebles and the bass, so you have the trebles here. So that's what happened. There's no doubt about it, even if there's no direct evidence. But somebody found out that if you want to make an organ-like crescendo, the organs of that day, you know, you have to add stops.
Exactly.
Then here's the order you add them in, and you just put it into the score arbitrarily, one after the other, and the decrescendo you take them off, which is, even if you have a registrant, it can't be done. Well, it simply can't be done, so it's totally ridiculous. And I must say, I've had a revelation in the last year. It was about 7 months ago or so. I played the Mass, and they had a one-stop de Bain harmonium organ.
Yeah.
And the choir was maybe 20, 25.
Oh, that must have been wonderful.
With a half-length grand piano, I mean, good piano, Yamaha piano. And here, this small instrument, like a harmonium, one stop, 8 foot, that was it, did the whole Mass magnificently, and I didn't feel I was pushing or anything. Isn't that fantastic?
Yeah.
So the sound of the reeds, the harmonics that they develop is so powerful that you could really get through. So at registrations where I played tonight, it was just 1 and 4 and grand jeu. And I could have done without the grand jeu, but when you have 55 singers, you have...
Well, that's another question about this.
That's another question,
yeah.
absolutely. Yeah.
Well, here's what we may be in for a computer crash here, but what I'm wondering is, can you give... there's always this question, given that there's so many different sources and there was no one authoritative version of it, even from Rossini, obviously.
Yes.
You know, there's always this question, when you have this piece performed by massive, massive groups, and of course with a pipe organ, which I think is a non-starter, but do you think that in any way these very large massed performances do violation to the music, or do you think the music can take it?
Oh, it's hard to be categorical about that, because, you know, music is like art in general. You can say certain things were done, and that's my approach to musicology. This is the way it was, do what you feel is right, but this is the way it was, and we can be sure the way it was. There are so many accounts of the way it was performed in 1864. So my feeling is that it's a little bit like Bach and the Baroque composers, Handel. It's doubtful that they had 50 singers when they performed their cantatas or even oratorios, although there came to be there were exceptions, and there came to be a tradition. But I think the way the music is written is so refined, so subtle, so that just filled with subtleties.
Exactly.
And if you have, the more musical forces you have, the larger acoustics you have, the more you're getting away from that idea of what really bel canto ought to be about, which is subtlety. And most of the performances that I've been involved in, if nothing else because the pianos were too massive and the singers are, they're trained to big,
well, it's a different
give big
performance
sounds,
style. Yeah.
So I prefer certainly to have a smaller, more intimate situation. But the fact is there that one thing I must say is that the second piano part differs somewhat from the first. And so we have actually a kind of small-scale orchestration that I think that is neglected, completely neglected. You just have the piano's hammering away or whispering away, whatever. But I don't know of anybody that's actually paid attention that the sonority of the second piano can be different. And that's why I'm sort of happy about this little discovery that the second piano was probably an upright piano and not a grand.
Right.
So, there's a huge span of possibilities, but I think what Rossini had in mind was something touching and intimate more, in keeping with his friendship, his deep friendship for this family for whom he was composing.
Yes. And also, there's a sort of subtext to this music.
Yeah, well, can I tell you about the Christe?
Well, I think we will have a crash, and I'm looking at this, and I'm watching this, and hoping we make it through. So, thank you so much. This is a marvelous interview, and it's very educational, and I thank you very much. And you are just so well positioned to be here, doing another part of this story, the harmonium. Okay, thanks very much, Kurt.
Yeah.